Picture yourself walking into an American factory in the spring of 1905. The floor is deafening, the air is thick with something, cotton dust, machine oil, coal smoke, depending on where in the country you're standing. You find the foreman near the door and you ask him one simple question. The same question almost anyone reaching for a first job today would ask without even thinking about it. What's the minimum wage here? And here's the strange part. He wouldn't get angry. He wouldn't try to lowball you. He would just stare at you, genuinely puzzled because he'd have no idea what those words meant. In 1905, in the richest, fastest growing industrial nation the world had ever seen, there was no minimum wage, not a low one, not a bad one, none at all. The phrase itself barely existed. Sit with that because it's stranger than it sounds. The United States declared independence in 1776. The federal government did not establish a national minimum wage until 1938. Roughly 160 years later, 160 years of factories, farms, railroads, and mills with tens of millions of people showing up to work every morning, and not one of them protected by a legal floor beneath their pay. So how did it work? If no law told anyone what an hour of labor was worth, who decided? Because a number always got set. Somebody always got paid something. That process didn't run on nothing. The answer is one of the most revealing stories in American history, and almost nobody learns it properly. It's a story about power far more than economics, about company towns, a Supreme Court that spent decades insisting the government had no right to protect you, a fire that changed a nation's conscience, and a woman most Americans have never heard of who kept a bill in a drawer waiting for the right moment to pull it out. So let's answer the question. Before 1938, how were wages decided? Let me take you into a world without a floor. The first thing to understand is that this wasn't chaos. To the people in charge, it felt like a philosophy. And that philosophy had a name: freedom of contract. The logic went like this. You're a free individual. The employer is a free individual. If you agree that he'll pay you $1 a day for 12 hours work, that's a private agreement between two free people, and it's nobody else's business. Not the states, not Congress's. To interfere, to say, you must pay him at least this much, was seen not as protection, but as an insult to the worker's dignity and an intrusion on the employer's liberty. It sounds almost reasonable out loud. That's exactly why it lasted so long. But there's a lie hiding inside it, and the lie is the word bargain. A bargain implies two parties with roughly equal power. Now picture the reality. On one side, a factory owner who employs 800 people and can replace any one of them tomorrow with someone waiting at the gate. On the other, a single worker with a family to feed, no savings, no unemployment insurance, that didn't exist yet either, and no other job lined up. When those two negotiate, there is no negotiation. There's one person naming a price and another deciding whether to accept it or starve. So the first real answer is brutally simple. Wages were decided by leverage, and in an economy with waves of immigrants arriving every year and children willing to work for pennies, the leverage sat almost entirely on one side of the table. Economists dress this up in cleaner language: supply and demand. When lots of people need work and there aren't enough jobs, the price of labor falls. The same way anything falls when there's a glut of it. True enough. But be honest about what that meant. A garment worker stitching shirtwaists 14 hours a day for a wage that couldn't cover rent and food at once. A child of 10 at a spinning machine because the family couldn't survive otherwise. The market wasn't wrong in its math. It was just indifferent to whether you lived. There was another mechanism, and it was clever: the piece rate. Instead of paying you for your time, they paid you for your output. So many cents per shirt sewn, per cigar rolled, per ton of coal hauled. Sounds fair. But watch what happens. Workers get faster, output goes up, so the owner quietly cuts the rate, and now you have to produce more just to earn what you earned last month. The piece rate turned the worker into an engine running faster to stay in place and let the employer set wages without ever announcing one. Let me take you into the company town. Picture a coal town deep in the mountains of West Virginia. The company owns the mine, obviously, but it also owns the land the town sits on, the houses the miners live in, the only store for miles, the school, the doctor. And when payday comes, it doesn't necessarily pay you in US dollars at all. It pays you in scrip. Scrip was private money, tokens, or paper notes stamped with the company's name. And here's the catch. It was only good at the company store. You couldn't spend it in the next town or put it in a bank. It only worked inside the world the company built around you. Now follow the loop because it's diabolical. The company pays you in scrip. You spend it at the company store where prices are high because there's nowhere else to shop. Your rent to the company comes out before you see your pay. The company doctor's bill comes out too. By month's end, most of what you earned has flowed right back to the company. And if it doesn't cover your bills, which it often didn't, the store extends you credit. Now you owe the company. Now you can't leave because you can't walk away from a debt. This had a name, the truck system, from an old word for barter. And if it sounds familiar, it's because it echoes in an old folk song about a coal miner, the one with the line about owing your soul to the company store. That wasn't poetry. That was a job description. So here's another answer, and a chilling one. In the company towns, wages weren't really decided at all. The company controlled the pay, the prices, the housing, and the debt all at once. The number on the pay slip was theater. The real wage was whatever the company let you keep. Not every American lived like this. Skilled tradesmen earned decent livings, and wages here were higher on average than in Europe. But the point isn't that everyone was miserable. It's that there was no floor. Your wage depended entirely on how replaceable you were, and the system was built to keep you that way. Now the story takes a turn most people never learn. You might be thinking, surely somebody tried to fix this, a state or Congress passing a law to set a wage or protect children. And the answer is yes, again and again. And for decades, they kept losing in the same place, the Supreme Court of the United States. For roughly 30 years, from about 1905 into the 1930s, the highest court in the country repeatedly took laws meant to protect workers and struck them down as unconstitutional. Its reasoning was that same idea we started with, freedom of contract. The court decided this freedom was protected by the Constitution itself, tucked inside the 14th Amendment's promise that no state shall deprive you of liberty without due process of law. The case that defined the era involved, of all things, a bakery. In 1905, in Lochner versus New York, the court looked at a law that simply said bakers couldn't be made to work more than 60 hours a week, and it struck it down, ruling the law violated the baker's freedom to contract for as many hours as he liked. The message was unmistakable. If a state couldn't even cap a brutal work week, it certainly couldn't dictate a minimum wage. This became the Lochner era. Reformers would win in a state legislature, pass a law, celebrate, then watch the courts tear it apart. The judges weren't cartoonishly evil. Most sincerely believed they were defending liberty. But the effect was that a handful of unelected men in robes had become the ultimate deciders of American wages. Not by setting wages, but by ruling that nobody else was allowed to. They were consistent about it. In 1923, in Adkins versus Children's Hospital, the court struck down a minimum wage law protecting women workers in Washington, D.C., some of the lowest paid people in the country. Its reasoning? Freedom of contract again. Those women weren't asking for equal pay with men. They were asking not to be paid so little they couldn't eat. The court told them the Constitution wouldn't allow it. So add this to the list, maybe the biggest answer of all. Before 1938, one of the most powerful forces deciding American wages was a legal doctrine, enforced from the highest bench in the land, the belief that government simply could not set a floor. But the pressure was building, and the cracks came from three directions at once. The first was the labor movement. If one worker had no power, maybe workers together did. Unions bargained collectively. Instead of one person facing the boss alone, thousands faced him as one and threatened to walk out together. For workers lucky enough to have a strong union, that became the real mechanism setting their wages. But it came at enormous cost. Strikes were met with hired guards, court injunctions, and outright violence, and organizing could get you fired, blacklisted, or beaten. Still, it proved something crucial. Wages weren't a law of nature. They were a negotiation, and negotiations could be won. The The second crack came from the states. There was no national minimum wage, but individual states could experiment, and in 1912, Massachusetts became the first to pass one. It was narrow, covering only women and children, and relying more on shaming employers than hard enforcement, but it was a beginning. Over the next few years, more than a dozen states followed. A patchwork formed. Your protection, if you had any, now depended on which side of a state line you lived on. Fragile and uneven. But it planted a radical idea that maybe society, not just the market, got a say in what your labor was worth. The third crack cut deepest. On March 25th, 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York caught fire. Inside were hundreds of workers, mostly young immigrant women, some as young as 14, sewing garments for wages that barely kept them alive. When the fire broke out, they found the exit doors locked, a common practice meant to stop breaks and theft. The fire escape collapsed. Onlookers watched young women jump from the 9th floor rather than burn. 146 people died. Most were women, most were young. The fire wasn't directly about wages, but it ripped the mask off the whole system, showed a country in horrifying detail what the market decides look like with no rules. Locked doors, packed floors, human lives treated as the cheapest, most replaceable input in the operation. And here's the detail that changes everything after. Standing in the crowd on the street watching was a young woman named Frances Perkins. She never forgot it. Years later, she'd say the New Deal, the whole wave of worker protections that would transform the country, was born the day she watched those women fall. Remember her name. Now the ground itself shifts because the entire economy falls off a cliff. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, and the country sank into the Great Depression. Unemployment climbed toward 1 in 4, and wages went into free fall. With so many people desperate for any work, employers could slash pay to almost nothing and still find takers. The lack of a floor, quietly cruel in good times, became openly savage in bad ones, dragging the whole economy down. Workers with no money can't buy anything, and an economy where nobody can buy anything cannot recover. In 1932, the country elected Franklin Roosevelt, promising a New Deal, and he made a decision that would echo for decades. He asked Frances Perkins, the same woman from the Triangle Fire, to be his Secretary of Labor. She'd become the first woman ever to hold a cabinet post in the United States. But she didn't just say yes. She said yes on one condition. Before taking the job, she read Roosevelt a list of what she intended to accomplish: unemployment insurance, a ban on child labor, old age pensions, what became Social Security, and a minimum wage, a legal floor beneath every American worker's pay. She'd take the job only if he backed her on all of it. He agreed. That handshake is one of the most consequential moments in the history of American work, and it happened almost entirely out of public view. The first attempt came fast, and failed fast. In 1933, the early New Deal set up industry codes with minimum wages and maximum hours across whole sectors. And for about 2 years, it worked like a national floor. But in 1935, the Supreme Court, still in the Lochner mindset, struck the whole thing down in a case involving a poultry company. The nickname says it all: the sick chicken case. Perkins was devastated but stubborn. She took her carefully drafted minimum wage bill and, instead of throwing it away, tucked it in a drawer. And she waited, because she understood the real obstacle wasn't Congress. It was that Supreme Court and its 30-year war on worker protection. So the question became, how do you change the mind of a court that's been saying no for 3 decades? The answer came from a political brawl so bold it's still argued about today. Roosevelt, re-elected overwhelmingly in 1936 and sick of watching the court dismantle his New Deal, proposed something audacious: the power to appoint up to 6 additional Supreme Court justices. On paper, it was framed as helping an overworked aging court. In reality, everyone understood the threat: pack the court with justices who'd stop striking down his laws. It became known as the court packing plan, and even his own allies thought he'd gone too far. And then, in the middle of the standoff in 1937, the court did something no one expected. In West Coast Hotel Company versus Parrish, it was looking at yet another state minimum wage law protecting women workers. By 30 years of precedent, it should have struck the law down. Instead, it upheld it. One justice, Owen Roberts, changed his vote. And with that single shift, the entire Lochner era came crashing down. The court declared that liberty of contract was not absolute and that government could act to protect workers and safeguard the welfare of its citizens. Because it landed right in the thick of the court-packing fight, historians nicknamed the switched vote the switch in time that saved nine. The single biggest obstacle to a national minimum wage was suddenly gone, and Frances Perkins still had that bill in her drawer. Roosevelt, sensing the moment had arrived, reportedly asked her in his casual way what had ever happened to that nice unconstitutional bill she'd tucked away. It wasn't unconstitutional anymore. The door was open, so in 1938 the fight moved to Congress. And even now, it was a war. The fiercest opposition came from the South, where industries like textiles and lumber had built their competitive advantage on paying workers, especially black workers, far less than the North. Southern members of Congress fought it ferociously, some trying to write in regional exceptions so the South could legally pay less. The labor movement itself was split. The bill was rewritten, watered down, and stitched back together, session after session. But on June 25th, 1938, Roosevelt signed it into law, the Fair Labor Standards Act. It took effect that October, and it did something no American law had ever done. It set a national floor beneath wages backed by the full force of the federal government. Here's what it established: a minimum wage of 25 cents an hour, a ceiling on the work week, 44 hours at first, dropping to 40, with time and a half for overtime beyond it, and a ban on oppressive child labor, finally pulling children out of the mines and mills. 25 cents an hour. I know how small that sounds. Adjusted for inflation, it's worth around $5 to $5.50 in today's money, less than the federal minimum is now. So it wasn't generous, but the amount was never the point. For the first time, the United States had officially declared there was a limit to how little a person's hour of work could be worth, that the market did not get the final say. That was the revolution. Not the number, the floor itself. But here's the part too often left out. The floor did not cover everyone. To get the bill past Southern opposition, huge categories of workers were carved out. Farm laborers, domestic workers, many service jobs. So the law first covered only about 1/5 of the workforce. And those exclusions weren't random. Agricultural and domestic work were, at the time, held disproportionately by black Americans, especially in the South, and by many women. So the very groups most exploited under the old no-floor system were, by design, left standing. Outside the door the law had just opened. It was a genuine breakthrough and a compromise built on exclusion at the same time. So let's come all the way back to the question we started with. Before 1938, how were wages decided? There was never one answer. Wages were decided by leverage, by an indifferent market, by pricing tricks, by the closed worlds of the company towns, by a Supreme Court that forbade a floor, and in the lucky places, by unions and scattered state laws. What 1938 really changed wasn't any single one of those forces. It changed the answer to a deeper question. Who gets to decide what a human being's work is worth? For 160 years, the answer had effectively been whoever holds the power in the room. After 1938, it became, at least in part, all of us, together, through the laws we choose to pass. A wage stopped being purely a private matter between the strong and the desperate and became partly a public one. And that argument never actually ended. Today, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, and it hasn't been raised since 2009, the longest stretch without an increase in the history of the law. Because it isn't tied to inflation, its real value quietly erodes every year Congress does nothing. Some states and cities, tired of waiting, have set far higher floors. So once again, just like before 1938, what your labor is legally worth can depend on which side of a state line you stand on. The patchwork is back, and so are the old questions. Should there be a floor at all? How high? Who decides? the market, or the public. That's why this story is more than trivia about an old law. The minimum wage was never really about a number on a paycheck. It was about a question as old as work itself. When you sell the hours of your one life, what is that worth? And who gets to say? For most of American history, the answer was the people with the power. The long fight to build a floor was, at its heart, a fight to give ordinary people a voice in answering it. So the next time you see a wage on a job posting or a paycheck with your own name on it, remember that the floor underneath it isn't natural and it isn't automatic. It was fought for over generations by a factory inspector who couldn't forget a fire, a cabinet secretary with a bill in her drawer, and millions of workers who refused to accept that their labor was worth whatever the powerful decided to pay. That floor is not a law of economics. It is a choice. It always was. And a choice once made can always be defended or quietly allowed to crumble. If this changed the way you think about the money in your own paycheck, hit that like button. It helps this channel reach more people who care about how history shapes the world we live in. Subscribe for more deep dives where we pull apart the stories everybody thinks they know. And I'm curious what you think, so drop it in the comments. Should the minimum wage be tied to inflation so it rises automatically, or should the public keep deciding it in Congress every time? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.